Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to We Make the Pod by Talking. This is Takashi. This is the episode 9 for this pod. It's right-wing media and its impact on youth of color. If you have any questions or want to get on the show, feel free to email us at wemakethepodbytalking@gmail.com. We're available on SoundCloud, Spotify, and Anchor. And shout out to DJ Juan for creating the intro and the outro music for this pod. And shout out to Daniel, who's regularly on this pod, for creating the artwork for our group. And if you haven't done so, please check the show notes. We put a lot of the articles and the materials and the sources we talk about onto the show notes. I encourage you all to check out the show notes for each episode. Yeah, and in Mandarin, it's kind of interesting because there's different ways to call someone an uncle or grandpa, depending on like the mom side or dad side. Like the mom side, like for example, grandpa is gong gong, but if you're coming from the dad side, like if the kid is, coming from the dad side of the family, then you say yeah, yeah. So it's different. And I don't know if that's just true in our culture or if that's like the standard Mandarin lingo.
Well, I think it's common in a lot of Asian cultures because I think it's true. That's true for like languages in India too. You have different words for like your mom's brother, dad's brother, mom's sister, dad's sister. Also like mom's mom, dad's mom. Like there's a more of a refinement of like familial relations.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how common that is throughout the world.
It's not in Japan though.
Oh, it's not in Japan?
No, Japan doesn't have that distinction, at least from my knowledge.
I know, yeah, mainland Asia has that distinction a lot. Because I know, yeah, Mandarin has it, but also like Hindi has it too. So.
Yeah.
I was reading a book actually that mentioned how anthropologists have they've already looked at this phenomenon and they've kind of, they've written about how cultures with higher like with I think it's more of a refinement of familial relations, there's a correlation with sexual taboos too, or something like that.
Wait, what?
Yeah. Or marriage taboos, like if you have fewer words for like your cousins, you're probably like in a culture that allows you to marry your cousin.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. If you have like more words, like then like the more family words you have, the more family names you have, the more taboos there are for like marrying people that are related to you.
That kind of makes sense because you're identifying specific individuals.
Yeah.
Then would that mean English is like, because you know how the stereotype of hillbillies marrying their cousins?
Yeah. So they probably have very few like family words.
Do y'all want to introduce yourself? Because I actually don't know everybody here either. I'm Takashi. I am an educator in Los Angeles, and I've been teaching for the past 8 years. And I currently teach at a charter school, which is a school that Rebecca started. And I know you were one of the founding teachers there too, yes. So that was pretty cool.
Yes. And I'm Rebecca. I'm an educator for the last 8 years myself. Teach U.S. history, world history, and I'm currently in a school leadership position in South LA.
I'm Daniel. I teach in Oakland. I used to teach in Los Angeles. I met Takashi at grad school and mostly been teaching English, some kind of literacy. This year I taught statistics, and next year I will teach gmWmE.
Nice.
I guess I'll go. Hi, everyone. My name is Yuji. I'm Daniel's friend. We met at the Stanford Hollyhock Institute like a long time ago in 2014, I believe. I currently teach in Oakland at a high school, 11th and 12th graders, U.S. history, English, and gmWmE. Nice to meet you guys.
Yeah, nice to meet you too.
Nice to meet you. I'm Carlos. I'm a PhD student at the University of Chicago, and I'm Takashi's friend. We were roommates in college.
I'll just start. Just to give you context, I know Yuji and Rebecca, y'all are new to this, but I don't know, for me, it's kind of an informal pod, so don't feel like you have to be a certain way, It's just like, I don't know, to me, it's like a casual conversation that's just being recorded. Yeah, thank you all for joining us. I know today's topic was on right-wing media and its impact on youth of color. And I know that Rebecca and I, we had some students who had those right-wing ideologies. And you know what? I don't know if I ever told you this, but in other schools I taught, I also had students kind of similar, but not as extreme as the students we had, right? So I'm always kind of curious because I feel like a lot of times these right-wing media or ideologies, we tend to think that it's only happening in South or rural, like mostly white areas, but there's also an impact on youth of color to a certain degree. So I just kind of wanted to know your experience with maybe students or even other teachers that had these right-wing ideologies at your schools.
You know, I'm curious to know, before I feel like I can answer, like, what do we mean by the right-wing ideologies? Because going into this podcast for this episode, I actually was a little bit confused because there's interplay between people say the word conservative versus the word right-wing. And so I'm kind of curious to know what we mean by these terms before, you know, like bullshitting about it and adding some commentary.
Well, what are your examples, Takashi? Like, how do these right-wing ideologies manifest?
I think for me, just my understanding is they tend to really like figures like Ben Shapiro or just people that tend to be more on the right. So like example could be like anti-immigration. Another is like pro-Trump, like, you know, wanting Trump to be president. I mean, there's a few more, but I just can't think of it. I don't know, Rebecca, if you want to pitch in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the conversation too, right? The fact that these terms sometimes do get convoluted and they're used interchangeably, and I'm sure some people have some pretty like strong feelings about that. But yeah, I would say similarly, I know some of the things, when I saw these questions, I was thinking more just about students who would consider themselves on the right or conservative or even just Republican, which I think stood out in the community that we were teaching when Takashi and I were together, because it was a predominantly Latino community, very much immigrant population, and it kind of went against, I think, that stereotype that if you are in a Latino community or an immigrant community, there's no way you're going to be conservative or that you're going to follow any like Republican ideologies. And we definitely started seeing some of that.
Yeah, I think for me, I guess the way that I understand these terms kind of reshapes the way I add commentary about them, because I have also like met students who they consider themselves Republican, conservative, whatever that term is. And it seems as though the thing that combines all of them, in my experience, is that they serve power, and whatever that means for them. They're willing to go with whatever the status quo is. They sanction sort of the institutions that exist, and they don't think that there are any sins. They don't see problems or with the intention or the structure of it. And so what they do is they just keep feeding into whatever is already in existence. And they're trying to grab at the power in that, whatever that means for them. But I do think it takes very diverse forms, in the same way that, like, just because you vote for Trump does not mean the same thing as, you know, somebody who voted for Trump for a very different reason.
Takashi and Rebecca, I'd be a bit more interested in learning a bit more about the specific, I guess, the more specific background of your students. Yeah. Because I feel like depending on the demographic, the motivations for being right wing or for holding their beliefs could be extremely different. So I mean, you guys are in LA, and there's this idea that it's surprising that Hispanics might be Republican, but my dad was from LA. My dad grew up in Boyle Heights. He was originally from Texas, but his teenage years and his young adulthood was spent in Boyle Heights, and his family was Republican. They're definitely Republican leaning. His sister is very Republican, and the motivation for them was economic, because they were a middle class family. They were small business people, at least in San Antonio. And when they moved to LA, they brought with them that, I guess, that middle class, small business mindset with them, which at least in Texas was was consistent with the Republican platform. My dad's parents actually, after talking with him more about it, I found out that they were Republican activists in San Antonio. They would go door to door and do canvassing for Republican candidates. So and it was mostly because Texas being, I think it's because of the proximity to the South and to proximity to those a lot of those cultural elements, which would probably amplify the religious components of Hispanic culture and Mexican culture. I think that's kind of what it comes down to. My aunt, apparently she's also very religious. She's very anti-abortion, and that's like a big motivating factor for religious Hispanics to support Trump and to support the Republican Party, because they're supposedly the party that's going to bring God back to the White House. Right? Yeah. I have other cousins on my mom's side of the family who also have can trace their family, at least on their mom's side, back to Texas. Like I don't know what it is. Texans are very religious. I don't know why, but well, yeah, I do know why, because again, like it's the South, right? The South, and it's, I mean, they're also sort of like attracted to like religious elements of Southern culture, like the Baptist church and how church is conducted and how that's different from the way Catholic Mass is conducted and stuff like that. All that being said, there's a strong religious element, I think, at least for non-immigrants from, say, Mexicans who come from Texas to LA. There's a strong religious motivation to just be Republican and to support Trump for that reason, right? Because the Republican Party is the party of Christianity. If the background of your students is more immigrant, if they're actually more like recent newcomers to the United States, that would be more surprising for me, because then they do have, you know, stronger ties to the plight of immigrants in the U.S., which the Republican Party, at least recently, has been more antagonistic towards. So that would be more surprising. But I there might be other. I can imagine other motivations for that. But what is the more specific background?
So I was really interested in this because at the same time, specifically after the election, Trump's election, there were a lot of people in my own life that were steering toward those ideologies, which were surprising. So, you know, I was doing some reading, some just investigating, getting to know my students more. And I think one of the things that I saw tied a certain group of students together was the fact that they didn't feel connected to their family, and in a sense didn't feel connected to that heritage or to that culture, right? So even as far as like some of our students didn't speak Spanish when parents didn't speak English, right? And we see that a lot. At least I know I see that a lot. And so one of the things I kind of just came to a conclusion or potentially learned as the students left my classroom was that this whole kind of like learning more about these ideologies allowed them to kind of create almost like an identity for themselves. And who knows, potentially that identity served anything that they might have been struggling with in their own growth and development with their family. I know I'm thinking of 3 students in particular that, like, when we would engage and talk about their relationship with their parents, like you can tell there was a lot of contention, a lot of misunderstanding about what their parents had done and why they had done it, and a lot of frustration about what their parents continue to do in the moment. And they saw some of these political beliefs as like almost the alternative. Like, I'm not happy with what's at home right now. I'm not happy with what my parents are doing or what they did. I don't agree with it. And so one of the ways that I can change that is to basically like vote the opposite or think the opposite or dig into things that aren't super common or around. That's one of the things that I saw.
Yeah, that's true.
This kind of reminds me of this observation I had the last couple of years around students who may feel like they're slightly alienated, and it's always I always pay really special attention to the kids who skateboard. I mean, growing up in the 80s and 90s, I always associated skateboarding with left-wing ideologies. I think in urban spaces now, because it's so predominantly left-wing, the new punk rock is like Ben Shapiro, or not necessarily advocating for like white nationalist Republican ideologies, but basically like the ideology that goes like, you know, that like calls out snowflakiness for snowflakiness, right? Like politically correct culture for politically correct culture. And the new punk rock is to say, fuck your feelings, right? And like, when I see kids with skateboards say things like that, or when they like quote Ben Shapiro, I know that like they're reacting to, I guess, like the very liberal ideologies that are, I guess, like
mainstream or
predominant, at least in urban centers, like you said, for sure. Yeah,
like they're reacting against that, and like and it's kind of like I know in like the history of punk rock, like Johnny Ramone was a Republican in the 70s, right? Which is really weird. But I feel like a lot of these kids, I'm thinking about maybe just 3 or 4 kids with skateboards who quote Ben Shapiro, right? Like I'm thinking about those kids, and I'm like, yeah, they're reacting to something that they don't like. And that what they don't like is that political correct culture that calls them racist or like shitty or sexist, or like, you know, you get called a shithead for possibly misgendering someone, right? And they don't feel like they did anything wrong, but like they blame the culture of political correctness and they're reacting against it. And they find refuge in Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan, and Ben Shapiro, and that's kind of what I see, at least in Oakland.
I think someone said it earlier, like that the affirming the status quo, right? It's always a lot more comfortable to just stay with what's happening. So I think those figures definitely give them validation for not needing to change or examine.
Yeah, I was also thinking too, because at the schools where we worked at, Rebecca, I felt like most of the folks, at least the teachers and most of the students, are kind of liberal in a way, not like maybe moderate or liberal, not necessarily on the right. I can't think of a teacher that has those right-wing ideologies. I mean, I could think of one staff, but he wasn't really explicit about it. I don't know. I felt like those students that we talk about, they're not the majority of the school. It's like a minority, you know, those that consume these media. But I felt like they also did it in a way to gain attention, you know, because it's like the feeling of alienation. Oh, this is the way I could get attention from the peers, from the students. I could get a reaction out of certain teachers because, you know, certain teachers might be more triggered than other teachers. I think we all react differently based on our experiences and our ideologies. But I know like certain teachers were like able to listen. Other teachers couldn't take it and just kicked them out of class, and it kind of fueled that anger and that anger even more, because he tried to like shut it down, or he tried to actively like make them not talk about it. They're gonna want to talk about it more. And we had some folks doing that, but you know, we also had folks that were able to just kind of listen in and see where these students were coming from. And it also kind of made me think of, I don't know if you all read the book by Neil Postman, Amusing Ourselves to Death. It was actually written in the 80s, and he pretty much predicted what was happening now. And he talked about how television, it's a form of amusement, and everything becomes a form of entertainment. So right now, like politics is becoming a form of entertainment. And that's also part of the reason why I start to see more students and young people becoming more political or talk about politics, maybe not necessarily engage in it, but like they consume it, because the politics is merging with the social media, is merging with entertainment. And, you know, it's pretty much, there's no boundary between like politics and entertainment at this point. It's like it just merged. It just becomes part of their daily culture. And a lot of the stuff that these students say, like I know they get it from the memes, like the internet, you know, different forums. A lot of them love anime. Not to say that you like anime, that you're gonna end up being a right winger, but that's something I noticed.
Yeah, you know, it's funny that we're all, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that's a trend now. Those are like,
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
You know, I got to teach at a high school in Venice, California. That was a charter school. and it was only, you know, students of color. But our kids were getting into the Ivy Leagues, they're going to UCs and so on and so forth. So we had that sort of privilege level people of color running our place, and the parents were Republicans. You know, they had very Republican values. I mean, they might have said they're Democrats, but you know, Democrats now are basically 90s Republicans. So like they had that same ideology going with them, and that's that nearness to privilege like that. And the privilege, it's very sexy. Like people are drawn to it. It's so cool. And so whatever gets you to that thing, which is advertised to them everywhere they go, they saturate their heads with these advertisements about how to be and what they want. I wonder about our role as educators. We work in very different settings. We're transitioning to different parts of education in our lives, but I've been in this thing for about 15 years now, and I feel like a baby in it, right? I'm still figuring it out. But what I've learned in the 15 years of various different kinds of institutions, from private institutions in South Orange County to Watts Continuation School in Watts, that was a charter continuation high school. There's not a lot of room in the classrooms to actually get into civil discourse using logic and reason. It's just not there. And so what happens is they pass along, and friends of mine who are in the university systems, in academia, doing that game, what they're realizing, at least in the past like 10 years, is the students who have privilege that get to like UMass or whatever it is, they have the content. They got lots of content, but they can't think.
You can't process it.
They can't, right? It's just too much noise. And so I'm curious to know from everybody else, what is our responsibility as teachers to either help organize and define and control that noise through critical thought, and how much do we actually do that, and what are the barriers?
Hey, Daniel, can you elaborate a little bit more on this inability to think? I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, so like, I think it basically comes down to, if you look at the Western academic tradition, it's based in logic, right? It's based on that like European Enlightenment logic that progressed society's ability to like create knowledge. And that logic was based in the development of an argument, understanding how premises work, why certain forms of thinking or reasoning are invalid, and that if you use them, you do not actually get at knowledge. What you do is you create fantasies or like narratives. So these are not actual forms of knowledge. And we don't do any kind of job in the secondary level or the elementary level that seriously gets at that ability to think critically. And that's what the entire university system is based on. We have the best university system in the entire world. Why are we not doing anything to help produce that kind of like thinking?
That really resonates with me, because I think one of the struggles that I've had as a teacher, and even now trying to juggle being a school leader, and I'm still in the classroom, is the critique of I'm not, especially as a history teacher, that I'm not covering enough content and that I'm going too slow, because I do engage in like Socratic seminars and small group discussions, and like speaking and talking and dialoguing was such a big part of my classroom. But that also meant like inherently the impact on the amount of content that I covered was frustrating to sometimes to school leadership, sometimes even to students. You know, you have some history buffs who come in and they have an idea of what a history class is supposed to be like. So they're really frustrated that they're not learning about all the battles and all the leaders and all the dates. And, you know, they want the facts, they want the content, they want the knowledge without having to really grapple and struggle with it. I mean, that for me, there's such a straight relationship with our testing culture. You know, even now that we've tried to move to somewhat of a more reformed test that focuses more on writing and critical thinking, there's still such an emphasis on covering content. And as a school leader now, and someone who attempts to support teachers, part of the struggle is convincing teachers that it's okay to spend time talking, and that it's okay if you don't cover all the content, right? Because they're like, well, you know, what do I do if? So I think that's one of the barriers for sure. This idea that information, like you are a giver of information rather than like a steward of processing and critically thinking. And I also think, I've seen a lot of people get really uncomfortable with creating those spaces in their classrooms because it takes away the power that the teacher, that positional power of like, I am the knowledge holder, right? If now I'm in dialogue with students and students come up with something that often I didn't have an answer for, like, oh, I've never actually thought of that, or I've never thought about it that way. Tell me more, right? That not everyone's comfortable assuming that role in the classroom.
Yeah, going along with what Rebecca said, I feel that too. And I see it a lot in my classroom and other teachers too. Like we tend to police ourselves. It's like we internalize what a teacher is supposed to be. Like we're supposed to be this person with a lot of knowledge, and we're supposed to feed the knowledge to the students, not necessarily have them question or critically think. You don't even need an administrator behind you to like police you. We just do it ourselves, and we do it to each other in a way, you know?
Yeah.
Because there's like certain curriculum that needs to be met, and we internalize it. That's the way we've been taught. We don't have any other ways to engage it. For me, I teach math, and it gets challenging because I don't want to give them the answers, and I want to have them figure out on their own. But the students get really frustrated really quick, and sometimes I just get like, okay, I got to help you then, just jump into it instead of having them sit through the challenge and making the mistakes and making them feel uncomfortable. But a lot of times, like they don't want to do it, and I feel like me or other teachers may not even want to go through it because it's just there's like 30 students to cater for, and if I'm too focused on this, the class is going to get wild, or they feel like they're not going to get anything out of it. Oh, and then there's this exam that's coming up. I got to make sure they understand everything. So a lot of these factors play into a role that makes it really hard for them to, just like learn critically and just feel like they can learn without my presence. And that's also part of the reason why I feel like social distancing is really hard, especially for the students that we teach.
This is off topic, but does anybody else hear that whistling of air?
Yeah, I hear it.
Right there.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I thought it was just me.
This idea of like what role we play as a teacher, I had one of the students that I know Takashi's thinking of showed up to the first day of 11th grade US history to my class, and he had heard or knew that I was this flaming liberal in his words. And he showed up in like a blue coat and was like ready to tell me he was a Republican and he didn't want to hear anything he was like, ready to go. And it was really, really interesting to work with him because, first, like teaching always does for me, it helps me grow and learn. And so I had to process that question that someone put up for the podcast today about like, what is our role as an educator, right? And what is our responsibility? Because I had to grapple with that, and I had to figure out, okay, like what is my responsibility to this young man right now, and how do I support him? What do I believe I need to support him in? Because one thing I did know is that I didn't automatically feel like I needed to change his beliefs, and that wasn't my responsibility as an educator. So the thing I landed on is, if there's anything I can support you in, it's going to be in knowing how to support your claims with like found evidence and logic, and be able to process through it and talk through it. And I remember, I'll never forget, and through our year together, at one point we're sitting across from each other, we're working on an essay, and he looks up at me, he goes, "Hey, Ms. Rodriguez." And I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "So you really don't care that I'm a Republican?" And in that moment I realized the deeper responsibility of an educator, which has nothing to do with goddamn politics, but it's like that love, care, and acceptance, right? That is that layer. And I looked at him and I was like, "No." He's like, "Wow, I thought you weren't going to like me or something." So, to get an insight to what he was fearing or thinking, and potentially how that might have impacted, how he wanted to prepare himself for every day or what he was, consuming. But that was a really good learning experience for me in terms of like figuring out how to navigate a space that is inherently political and still not necessarily persecuting a student that you didn't agree with, right? I think the line can sometimes easily get blurred with a lot of teachers who think it is their responsibility to change a student's belief. So I don't know. It's definitely still something I'm grappling with. It's complicated and it's scary sometimes, to think of those really difficult like shifts that are happening.
Well, Rebecca, I think I think the guy is probably going to be a flaming liberal by the time he's 40.
Well,
as a result of your efforts.
I can't show you a paper he wrote, and I was like, wait, what? Like, where did this come from? And it was all just based on his reading, and I don't even think he realized he wrote a paper that was completely obliterating one of his arguments. But I didn't, at the time, I didn't point it out. I was like, all right, cool.
Yeah, it just seems to me that I think a lot of young people, they tend to take up oppositional identities when they're younger. And I think a lot of times, like, the kids who are punk rock and like doing the whole like, oh, I'm gonna be a alt-righter or whatever, like it's kind of a phase. I think Takashi said it like in probably the simplest way possible. These guys are just looking for attention, right? Like, I think a lot of times, like when people develop these oppositional identities, they're doing it to try to figure out their own selves, and if they have a positive role model, regardless of what side of the aisle that they're on, they will eventually turn around toward ultimately like the thing that gives the world justice, right? So what that means is sometimes in a classroom, you got to play the Republican, and you got to make shitty arguments. And it's always been fun. It's always been kind of a fun kind of project for me to try to out-Republican the Republicans in my own government classroom. So, because I know that it's actually good for the kids to argue against me and try to say that I'm a shithead. So, I don't know. That's just something that I've done, and it's so far worked out.
Yeah, and I felt like the teachers, and I've seen it in other schools too, that try to get the students to change their mind or like really like come at them like aggressively or try to resist what they say or shut them down. I feel like the students really get angry and just even lash out even more. It just fuels this ideology. It's almost like I don't know if we call it like a reverse psychology. Like, you try to shut it down, they're going to want to come back at it even more. So it's like you're trying to,
ultimately, as teachers, we still serve as that figure of authority and power, right? So in the space, a lot of times our students are going to act out or use us as a way to figure out how they interact with power and where it is that their place is amongst an institution. So absolutely. I think a lot of students are influenced one way or another by their teachers.
Yeah.
I know the context for this conversation is about, right-wing media and its grip of the youth. I'm curious about the other side, which is, they're oftentimes taken for granted because it's like, well, of course you're supposed to think those things. There you go. Or those are your values. There is a lot of draw towards the right for a lot of reasons in this country, politically and culturally. But there are kids that like stick to their guns and they're like, nope. It's like, but you can do computer science like in your sleep. Why would you not? You're like, but I believe in something. I'm going to go into social work. And it's like, oh, well, all right then. What keeps people to those values, and what is the inspiration behind those things? For me, I think, I forget somebody was talking about this. The kids who tend to be really culturally connected to their roots are usually the ones that are like, nope, I'm going to help people. That's the whole thing of this. I don't care what it's about. Like, that's what I'm going to do. And I wonder if those boundaries are broken by other values, or what those limitations are.
That connects to the first thing I thought of when you asked that question, which was exposure. Like, I think when young people are exposed to being able to help, it's addicting. I've really never seen a student who goes out that we've taken on a service learning project or an experience and they've helped and they've had that human interaction and they've felt the power of really like agency and change. Or like, oh, I can actually do something about what's happening. I think those experiences are really, really influential to students. I think a lot of the students that I've seen go into like just human service occupations and careers have been students who at the high school level have, and now I'm at a junior high and middle school, and I've seen the same thing in the last couple of years. There are students that have had that exposure, have had that experience of volunteering or service learning, or, you know, they're doing something with their church. And I think that's the same thing for a lot of immigrant children who are like consistently exposed to the need for help, and how help it can be given, right? Sometimes some of our issues seem so ridiculously large, but when you're exposed to being able to make a small difference, I think it's really powerful.
Tanya, when you asked me that, it kind of made me think of my own experience, actually. Because in like high school, took this like career test, and it kept saying like I should be an engineer or some kind of mathematician. And a lot of my friends have said that too, because I was doing pretty well in math. And part of the reason why is because, you know, I've mentioned in the previous pods, like, because I was in Japan and the math over there was just faster. And then when I got here, I was like, what the hell? I already did this shit, you know, like this is too easy. And then
racist.
And eventually, I don't know, I just became more confident in it, because in Japan, I was like one of the worst person in math. But then when I came over here, you know, just because of the curriculum,
like, America's the best.
Yeah, it's like, what the hell, you know, I already learned this. And yeah, when I was I took the career test, the results, you know, said, you know, I should be doing engineer or going to the computer sciences or whatever. But I didn't really have a passion to it. And Rebecca, what you just described about like service learning and volunteer, I started doing that in high school. And, you know, I was involved in sports, and I did some like community service, and I got exposed to that. And I just felt like, yeah, you know, I want to do something for the people. I don't know what it is, but maybe I could be like counselor or teacher. And that's kind of one of the paths that led me to where I am now. Even though like people have said, oh, you have the ability to do something else, I ended up just choosing, I guess, kind of best of both worlds, because I am teaching math. So yeah, that aligns to both.
My career test told me airline pilot or funeral director.
Wow.
Interesting.
Funeral director, huh?
I kind of want to share this too. I had this was at a different school. I had a student who actually was a skinhead, and it was interesting because where I was teaching was in Long Beach, and there were no white students. It was a continuation school, all these students of color. And I don't know if that student was actively involved at that time, but he was Pacific Islander, and he had a mixture of Asian, like Native Hawaiian, and, you know, different ethnicity. And he looked like racially ambiguous, but he had like a, you know, bald head. And when he mentioned he was, you know, his skinhead, I was just kind of surprised, but that, you know, he was part of that. I felt like he didn't like say anything that was like problematic or acted in any way that was harming the students. And I eventually like developed a really close relationship with that student. And, you know, I was there when he had his baby shower, because, you know, his girlfriend was pregnant. And, you know, I've met his like family members and stuff, but like, I don't know, it's just like, he just mentioned that he was part of a skinhead, but that was it. I didn't really question it, or like, I never really thought about like asking deeper until maybe like this question of the pod came up. I just thought it was interesting that he identified as that. And a lot of people think LA, as we mentioned, is like a very liberal place, and there's no racism or no KKK. There's actually like neo-Nazis and skinheads in like areas like Orange County. I know Whittier has certain population of that too. And I think the student I'm talking about, he was probably part of one of the Whittier like skinheads or something at that time. Like, I don't know how big that population is now, but it was just interesting. Even though like he came from a group that had very opposing ideologies to me, I was still able to maintain a relationship, like a positive one, and, you know, with him and his family, despite of the differences.
Takashi, was the rest of his family also skinheads? Like,
he lived with a single mom with like siblings. I didn't get that sense. I think it was just him. And part of it, you know, kind of like what Yuji was mentioning, like it's, you know, the counterculture, or, you know, like the skater punks. This is something that will stand out and I'll get attention, or I can like have my own identity. Yeah,
I think sometimes it's a lot of that internalized racism we all carry around too, you know, that self-hatred. And I think sometimes in certain beliefs that our students or anybody acquires, like you're either affirming something that you like about yourself or you're trying to deny something about yourself.
Yeah, and there's also like this really confusing gradation of what a skinhead is. There are like left-wing skinheads, there's right-wing skinheads. Some of them are vegan. They're all over, but you could also be kind of vegan and right-wing too, right? Like, which makes no sense to me, but like that's the thing, right? So yeah, maybe your student had kind of like this predilection for maybe understanding like or just being drawn towards like some like anti-ideology of some type. But yeah, like I always find people like that absolutely fascinating. It would be really cool if you like turned vegan though. I don't know. Takashi, have you like kept in touch with him at all?
Once in a while. I don't think he's vegan though.
I have to ask about his eating patterns.
He's a disappointment to the movement.
Yeah.
You know, something
Shame.
popped into my head too about just nationalism and this pride about America and like our flag bearing countrymen and counterparts. And I think like, you know, we have a long history of, when I say we, like a lot of people of color, not voluntarily a lot of times, but history of military service. And I think that also in families perpetuates this idea of like American pride, and when students or young people are trying to figure out like where they stand in the political realm, that cognitive dissonance can be difficult to deal with, right? Like if I have military service in my family, I'm supposed to, I know growing up, like my father served in Vietnam, not by choice, he was drafted, and that prompted my brothers to join the military. Weirdly enough, not really understanding, like my dad didn't go on his own, like he was dragged from his house, right? But my brothers decided to join and were very much like America and, you know, whatever, Marines and all that good stuff. And it was hard for me to kind of separate myself from that as I was growing and forming my own identity, because anything that wasn't like American supporting and American loving was like anti them, right? And that was hard to process, for sure.
Yeah, and I also feel like the whole idea of like of people wanting to join the military being like tied up with this idea of like masculinity, right? Like this whole identity of this identity built around like wanting to protect your loved ones, like that's the sexiest thing, like own a gun, protect your family, like that kind of thing is like, yeah, it's a big thread in what it means to be a man now, because like, you know, ever since women started working in mass numbers in the 70s, like, you know, wages for everybody has gone down, right? And so I think like the one and since factory jobs are pretty much disappearing, I think like the one last bastion for American masculinity is to own a gun and protect your family. It helps if you know, that's why like I always find it really funny that like no one bats an eye that when you see a right-wing protest, there's always going to be an AR-15, there might be a swastika, and there's going to be someone's going to bring a Confederate flag, right? Like it's just, to me, like those things are just like normalized now. And I think a big part of that puzzle is trying to figure out like men trying to figure out who they are. And I've had a lot of students that were students of color, come from immigrant backgrounds, and they're like, I want to join the military. And I'm like, all right, cool. Like that's awesome. Why? And then like they gave me a whole range of answers. But like I think the thing that's pinning it all is like, I want to be a man in America. And it's so hard to be a good man in America, right? And like, and that fuels like the whole MRA thing, and it fuels the whole again, like that right wing threat of like gender roles are starting to dissolve, and like we can't make sense of things anymore. Like there's no up or down or left or right. Like this doesn't make a lot of sense. And so maybe owning a gun is like a thing that like people seem to want to gravitate towards. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, when I was younger too, the military was appealing to me, but more about like the benefits. Because at that time, my immigration status was a little funky. I wasn't sure if I was able to stay or not. And like, you know, the money and like the benefits that they claimed they were offering was just like really enticing. We also had a lot of recruiters, like military recruiters. I don't see that a lot I mean, I've never seen it at the school where I've taught, but like where I was going, I felt like they were there. And when I signed up, that was the mistake. They just kept calling me, and I was just like, oh, should I just go to or should I not? But the presence was just really high.
So I don't come from. I'm not in a situation where I'm exposed to a lot of young people and trends and how they're identifying themselves, and I guess so. I don't really have a lot of firsthand experience with this phenomenon of more young people gravitating and more people of color gravitating to right-wing movements. But I have been doing like some readings recently that remind me a lot of, or that for me seem to connect to the things that you guys are saying, especially the stuff that Yuji is saying. So it seems to me that that this phenomenon of young people of color kind of gravitating to right-wing movements, for me it seems parallel to something I've been reading about in this book called The Clash of Civilizations by Samuel P. Huntington, which is basically, it's a book about looking at global conflicts through the lens of like cultural differences and stuff. And he has this, it's a big book, and he talks a lot about the this phenomenon in the Middle East where you had a huge international movement of people gravitating more to political Islam or Islamism, or basically Islamic theology, merging the religion with like your government. And so this is something that resulted in the Islamic Revolution in Iran, sequential Islamic revolutions in other majority Muslim countries. Before that, you had like kingdoms, right? You had kingdoms and you had fiefdoms, and it's not until recently that you had more Islamic governments. And so in this book, he attributes that actually to a huge explosion in population in these countries. At the same time that you had these revolutions, the populations in these areas was also booming. A lot of people who lived in the desert or in small villages, they started moving to cities, right? You had a lot of these cities that were also booming because industries were developing, and so you had a lot of internal migrants into these areas from like rural places, right? And what happened in these cities after that, after these cities boomed with all these new people, right, shoved into the same area, apparently what happened was a lot of alienation, which is a term both Rebecca and Takashi used earlier. People suddenly, all these new immigrants or these new internal migrants, they didn't really know how to live in their new circumstances. They came for a job or they came for school, and suddenly they felt lost because they didn't know what else they were supposed to do outside of that. They weren't sure what morals to follow, right? They'd probably grown up a little bit with Islam or with religion, but not to such a degree that they could. Well, a lot of these people couldn't really read either. I mean, a lot of people were also illiterate, so they didn't really have a lot of exposure to like the Quran itself, even though they might have practiced like elements of the religion, right? So when you had all these people, these like lost people in these cities, it made them very susceptible to like whatever political movements were happening at the time, right? There was one political movement which was like political Islam, which is basically told people that like they would suddenly receive some lifestyle they could follow by just following this political organization. They could, by adhering more to like Islam in an intellectual manner, by like reading the Quran, and then following their political movement to establish the religion as the government, or some form of the religion as the government, that would suddenly give them like a way of life, right? And suddenly they would know, okay, like how to proceed with their lives after that, right? And so he uses that. So Huntington uses that as an example of how urbanization, like like large scale urbanization leads to alienation, and then alienation also leads to like radicalization or these very strong like political movements. And that reminded me a lot of like what Yuji was saying. What Yuji's saying, like kids now are adopting like, well, they've always adopted oppositional identities, right? But it kind of there's more of a, there might be a migrational backdrop to that story too. Like the question is like, why, what are the conditions under which students or young people feel alienated, right? For the case of your Samoan student, Takashi.
Oh, no, I don't. He wasn't Samoan.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, but he was Pacific Islander.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's Pacific Islander. He's from a single parent household. He probably grew up in circumstances where it was challenging to find like a stable ideology, right? Something that some lifestyle that seems to work, right? And that makes him susceptible to things that do seem to work, to like new families. Like in previous conversations I've had with you, Takashi, like I know you've used this terminology of like building families, like when gang members, right? A lot of gang members come from like unstable families, and to find structure, to find not necessarily masculinity, like masculinity is a form of structure, right? But it can be manifest in certain ways, in other ways, but nonetheless it's a structure, right? It's a lifestyle structure that gives you guidance in your life. And by like having you join with a family, right? Like a synthetic family, I suppose, right? Right. That's what a gang is. And I think it's not very different from what your Pacific Islander student is doing. There's a component where he's looking for structure. He's looking for life structure, and he finds that in this skinhead group. And then there's another element of it being like nationalist, because that's sort of because his Pacific Islander identity, that's very much a lot of that might be lost to him. You know, he was probably born in the US. He has very little exposure to the original native settings of Pacific Islander culture where he's from, right? So he doesn't get enough of that. He doesn't get enough of that resource being outside of that environment to be able to identify with like Pacific Islander culture as much. You need a substitute. So then there's the skinhead group, or there's just any nationalist group, right?
Yeah.
These are his new, right? And because of that disjoint between him being originally coming from a Pacific Islander group but not being in that environment, right? You need a substitute, right? You need to nativize, basically. I think that, so like what you guys were saying, like that's sort of the lens that I'm coming from, and for me it makes sense that way, right? This is all sort of the result of new people moving into or smaller people from smaller communities moving into larger communities and just feeling alienated because they don't know how to live.
Definitely what I saw with some of the older people in my life who were kind of changing course into a more conservative or right-winged set of beliefs and ideologies. It was, I think they all had that in common. Like they were definitely struggling economically. So they were like marginalized economically, and they were struggling to kind of fit the mold of whatever the society is they were living in. You know, they were struggling finding jobs. Their relationships weren't exactly the way they believed they were supposed to be. So I can definitely see that as an element.
Yeah, I also feel like a lot of the framing of this conversation has been kind of male-centric. And I think the underlying kind of ideology that drives a lot of people towards these reactionary movements is patriarchy, and at least a want to have some sense of order. Mm-hmm. And reverting back to like this old way of like a patriarchal family structure, a patriarchal way of being entitled to certain things in society has been kind of like the theme for men. The funny thing about women, I've noticed, young women I've taught in my classroom who are also very right-wing, their main issue has been abortion, which is really strange because that's such a white women issue
Yeah.
in when it comes to like just like mainstream feminism in general, but I see a lot of young women of color, particularly Latina women, are like, they're so anti-abortion. It comes out at the weirdest times. Like they may be pro-immigrant, but then the first thing you start talking about, like when it comes to abortion, God, like personal responsibility, like they just double down, and you're just like, I can't argue with you. Holy shit. I don't know. I don't know if any of you have experienced that in your lives, but that abortion issue is such a crazy wedge issue with this particular group that just like it like I was kind of blown away by it the last like couple of years that I've seen it in discourse.
I mean, being a mother is such a fundamental part of Latino culture, you know, and without children, you're now taking away like one of the biggest identity makers or identity pieces in the culture. I can definitely see that being an issue. That doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, I mean, I've had experience with that in the classroom. That's just one of those issues that is firm because it's a very deep cultural value. At least there's no way to budge that in any way. But I do think that idea is correct, that it depends on what we serve. Like we're serving these like institutions or whatever they happen to be, and it's very easy to be swayed. I think that's the scary part. Like right now, it takes so little for somebody to say, "Oh, is that true? I didn't know that you could get rid of that by just rubbing it like this way." And it's, for me, I like the fact that we can talk about this so that it becomes part of some larger conversation, hopefully. Because for me, especially in this pandemic, there's just so much more noise, and I just get plugged into it. And it's very hard for a person who has lots of privilege to parse through that and have conversations and be challenged, and think that things could be very different. And I think if something that this situation has shown, and I'm not the first person to say this, is there's a serious problem with poverty. That it's getting to the point where if you ignore it, you're a sociopath or you're a psychopath. You've lost touch with reality. So I think those are also certain lines that tread that mark between right wing and left wing, because I think we started out this conversation talking about like who are the characters that support these views and these values, and what are those ideas that they hold. I think that line is not as clear as we think, but if you start to sort of examine what they are, like what do people actually believe about the right of authority and the will to use it, and if they can relinquish that, that's, I don't know, I think we're stuck right now, or it feels that way. It feels like everybody's arguing, but on a different logical plane. No one logic is better than the other. So somebody that says, look, the earth is flat because that's the way I feel, it has equal value to somebody that says, well, I heard that David Blaine made it flat. That distinction is very, very small right now. And that's worrisome, because there is no sense of truth. It's just whatever people say it is until the next news cycle. That's the way I've been feeling.
It's also like the luxury of being able to think several years ahead. You mentioned like privilege and like trying to unpack the privileges that we have as people who have just like gained an education in the United States, right? I think one of the things I realize is like I'm able to look further ahead because I'm no longer worried about those basal needs of like housing, food, right? Those things are stable for me now, thankfully. So now I can think, higher places in my brain are thinking. And, I was having a conversation with someone who admittedly was like, well, things aren't so bad right now under Trump. And we were like, wait, what? Like, what are you talking? So we're just talking. And, one of the things he said was very much an immediate consequence that he was feeling. He's a truck driver. He's like, my loads are paid like twice as well under his administration. He's moving a bunch of military like tanks and stuff, right? So that immediate gratification that person was feeling like completely outweighed anything that was kind of outside, his sphere of survival. So sometimes I wonder too how much when we think about like what makes people want to help and what makes people care about these bigger things other than themselves, I mean, maybe there's a connection there of like if we have people that are struggling with some of the basic things that are needed for survival, how can we expect them to be able to like focus or think long term or think, you know, bigger context or broader context? But I remember him making that comment and I was like, well, it's kind of hard for me to argue. Like, I mean, obviously we can talk about like, you know, but in that moment he was making more money, and it was enough money to give him some stability finally. And that hadn't happened under a president before Trump. Having to argue against money in our nation is difficult.
Yeah.
Yay for hypercapitalism.
A lot of the mistakes that the current administration has been making, they tend to externalize the blame. Like, oh, it's, you know, China's problem. Or it's like, I know it's you know, never take responsibility for your own actions.